Now, a new analysis shows that the 6-ton iconic altar stone at the heart of Stonehenge originated from northeastern Scotland rather than southwest Wales.
For centuries, people stared at Stonehenge and thought the answer was in the stones. The circle, the alignment, the massive blocks that should have been impossible to move. But when ground-penetrating radar scanned beneath the surrounding landscape, the mystery changed completely. Researchers were no longer looking at one monument. They were looking at a buried system, hidden pits, vanished structures, unknown monuments, and patterns that had been invisible from the surface for thousands of years. Some of the readings were so large that they made Stonehenge itself look like only one piece of something much bigger. And that is why the old question may have been wrong. Maybe the mystery was never just how Stonehenge was built. Maybe the real answer was buried beneath it all along. Beneath that question sits a real scientific program, not another loose Stonehenge theory. The Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project ran from 2010 to 2014, led by Professor Vince Gaffney of the University of Bradford, with the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute in Vienna. It was a 4-year international survey covering 12 square kilometers of the World Heritage Landscape. Researchers did not rely on one machine or one pass across the ground. The team used 5 non-invasive methods, including ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and GPR tomography, to look beneath the surface without digging. That mattered because the area was too large for old hand-carried equipment. At that pace, the same survey could have taken decades, not 4 years. Motorized all-terrain vehicles made the difference. They pulled multi-channel GPR arrays developed by the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute, allowing the team to scan huge sections of land with detail that had not been practical before the late 2000s. This is why the breakthrough happened when it did. The landscape was always there, but the right tool had only just arrived. Stonehenge had already been studied almost obsessively before the survey began. Since the 1920s, systematic RAF aerial photography and decades of professional archaeology had examined the surrounding 12 square kilometer zone. Yet only 6 known monuments had been identified there. That number made the later scan results harder to dismiss because they showed how much could remain hidden in a place everyone thought they knew. English Heritage and Historic England later revised the official interpretation of the Stonehenge World Heritage Site to reflect the findings. That is the point that separates this from fringe speculation. The discoveries became part of the institutional baseline, not an outside claim. Radar had not added a small detail to the old story. It had opened a different one. When Gaffney's team began processing the data, the buried landscape did not look like a few missing pieces. It looked like the entire picture had been drawn too small. Radar results first changed the story through a number. The Hidden Landscapes project identified more than 17 previously unknown prehistoric monuments beneath the Stonehenge landscape, raising the known total from 6 to more than 23. These included a buried henge near the Cursus, unknown pit alignments, post holes, and possible processional features. Hidden monuments make the discovery harder to dismiss because none of them could be seen from above. Every one of the 17 new features was invisible from the surface, missed by RAF aerial photography from the 1920s, and unseen by archaeologists, antiquarians, researchers, and tourists who crossed the same ground for 500 years of documented study. 3-dimensional mapping gave the scans their real power. The GPR data did not simply detect strange marks underground. It mapped the features by depth, orientation, plan dimensions, and their relationship to known surface monuments. For the first time, researchers were looking at a 3D map of a buried prehistoric landscape, not just isolated radar shadows. Non-invasive discovery is what makes the evidence both strong and incomplete. No soil was removed, no monument was disturbed, and no test pits were dug. The transformed picture came entirely from geophysical data, meaning each of the 17 monuments has been mapped in detail, but not yet physically confirmed by direct excavation. Buried features also showed that the landscape did not belong to one moment. The survey identified traces from different phases of a long construction history, matching Stonehenge's own multi-stage development from around 3000 BC to 1500 BC. That means the ceremonial landscape likely evolved over centuries, with new monuments added as older ones remained hidden beneath the ground. 17 buried monuments were already enough to change the investigation. But 6 years later, the same landscape produced a discovery that made those findings look like only the beginning. As the numbers changed the scale of the investigation, one discovery brought the evidence back toward the stones themselves. Among the Hidden Landscapes Project findings was a previously unknown timber monument, a large post-hole circle identified directly beside Stonehenge. This was not a distant feature on the edge of the landscape. It was buried next to the same standing stones researchers had examined for centuries. Buried post holes reveal what the eye can no longer see. The wooden posts had vanished because wood does not survive 5,000 years in that soil, but the ground still preserved their traces. GPR detected voids and fill anomalies where the posts once stood. Their arrangement suggested a large timber structure, possibly comparable in scale to the stone circle itself. A timber structure beside the stone circle creates 3 possible timelines. It may have come before Stonehenge as an earlier phase. It may have stood beside the stone monument as a companion structure, or it may have been built and removed during the same construction program. The radar showed the pattern, but it could not decide which version was true. Independent confirmation made the finding harder to dismiss. Magnetometry supported some of the same post-hole anomalies first identified by GPR, giving researchers 2 separate geophysical readings of the same buried feature. Even without direct excavation, that overlap increased confidence that the signal represented a real subsurface structure, not a data error. Older records make the discovery more unsettling. No major excavation program since the early 20th century had described this timber monument. No aerial photography revealed it. No surface observation recorded it. The feature was hidden in plain ground, detectable only by an instrument capable of reading beneath the surface. A timber monument beside the stone circle changed the immediate context of Stonehenge, but the scans also showed that an already known feature, studied for more than 200 years, had been hiding something of its own. After the timber monument shifted attention back toward the stones, the scans moved to a feature already known for centuries. The Greater Cursus, north of Stonehenge, was not obscure. It was a Neolithic enclosure nearly 3 kilometers long and about 150 meters wide, documented since the 18th century. Before the radar survey, many believed this was one of the better understood parts of the landscape. GPR results changed that assumption by finding hidden structure inside the Cursus itself. The scans revealed unknown pit alignments and terminal features at both ends of the enclosure. These details suggested the monument may have worked as a processional boundary or pathway, not just a long, empty enclosure. 2 centuries of surface study and aerial observation had missed the features that explained how people may have moved through it. Methodology became the real warning sign. If ground-penetrating radar could find hidden structural detail inside a monument studied since the 1700s, then every known feature around Stonehenge could be more complex underground than it appears above. The 17 new monuments were not just additions. They were proof that the visible landscape had always been incomplete. Professor Mike Parker Pearson's Stonehenge Riverside project, running from 2004 to 2009, had already suggested that the landscape may have been crossed by a ceremonial route. The new Cursus features gave that idea a sharper physical form. The terminal pits appeared at the ends of the enclosure, exactly where a planned passage would need points of entry and exit. The radar did not solve the route, but it showed why the Cursus could no longer be treated as an empty boundary. Comprehensive coverage is why the discovery matters. Researchers were not targeting hidden Cursus features when they deployed GPR across the landscape. They were scanning everything systematically, and the old monument produced new evidence almost by accident. That made the result more unsettling. Even the familiar parts of Stonehenge were still hiding structure beneath the ground. Hidden detail inside a monument studied for more than 200 years was significant, but the largest radar discovery in the landscape was still waiting near Durrington Walls. Hidden detail inside the Cursus exposed why Stonehenge had stayed incomplete for so long. The landscape was not invisible to curiosity, only to the tools available at the time. Ground-penetrating radar sends electromagnetic pulses into the soil, then reads how those signals return from buried materials. Stone, chalk, filled pits, and disturbed ground all reflect differently, allowing GPR to map hidden features in 3 dimensions without cutting into the surface. Modern scanning changed the investigation because older equipment could not cover the Stonehenge landscape at this scale. The breakthrough came from motorized multi-channel GPR arrays developed by the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute in Vienna. Before the late 2000s, scanning 12 square kilometers with enough detail to detect small post holes would have taken decades with hand-carried machines. Timing matters, because this was not a case of secrecy, delay, or lack of interest. Archaeologists had studied the area for generations, but the buried landscape required a tool with speed, coverage, and high resolution at the same time. The survey happened when it did, because that kind of instrument finally existed. Without it, even the most careful researcher was still looking at only the surface. Radar maps can show shape, depth, orientation, and density, but they cannot explain purpose. A buried pit may appear clearly in the data, yet GPR alone cannot prove whether it is prehistoric, historical, or natural. Every discovery from the Hidden Landscapes project began as a mapped anomaly, and only further archaeological work can turn that signal into a complete human meaning. Independent checks made the evidence stronger. Researchers compared GPR results with magnetometry, so when both methods detected the same buried feature, the signal carried more weight. This is what separates the project from a single scan or a visual guess. It created a buried map that could be tested, challenged, and followed into the next discovery. Near Durrington Walls, that buried map produced a signal so large that scale became the first problem. Researchers were no longer looking at a hidden detail, but at something much bigger. Durrington Walls became the place where the buried map suddenly grew beyond anything expected. In 2020, the University of Bradford and international partners announced a massive circle of up to 20 pits, each about 10 meters wide and 5 meters deep. Arranged across roughly 2 kilometers and located 2 kilometers northeast of Stonehenge, Professor Vince Gaffney described it as the largest known prehistoric monument in Britain. Published evidence gave the discovery its weight. The finding appeared in Internet Archaeology in 2020, a peer-reviewed academic journal with named researchers, named institutions, and documented methods. This was not a rumor from a scan, or an early claim waiting to be checked. The dimensions, location, and survey process were placed into the formal archaeological record. Scale is what makes the pit circle difficult to absorb. Stonehenge's famous Outer Sarsen Ring measures about 30 meters across, yet one of the buried pits near Durrington Walls was so large that the stone circle could fit inside it with room left over. The visible monument suddenly had to be understood beside something far larger, buried only 2 kilometers away. Surface evidence had shown nothing. No crop marks, no earthwork traces, and no aerial photography had revealed the pit circle before the geophysical survey. Its location mattered even more because Mike Parker Pearson's Stonehenge Riverside project had already identified Durrington Walls as the likely settlement and working base of Stonehenge's builders. Britain's largest prehistoric monument was hidden beside their own base. Backfilled pits created the deepest question. Geophysical analysis suggests some pits may have been deliberately filled in during antiquity, not simply abandoned. That would mean people dug them, used them, and then chose to close them. Radar can map the shape and depth, but it cannot explain the purpose, the ritual, or why something this large was buried. A mapped, published, peer-reviewed pit circle now sits at the center of the investigation. But its meaning depends on one unanswered question. What was it built to do, and why was it sealed? Mapped pit circles near Durrington Walls made the radar results feel enormous, but they also exposed the limit of the word solved. No professional archaeologist from the Hidden Landscapes project or the 2020 discovery called it a final answer. Published research spoke instead of a new understanding of Stonehenge inside a sacred landscape, which changes the frame, not the purpose. 17 buried monuments, the timber post hole circle, the hidden Cursus features, and the Durrington Walls pit circle all began as geophysical signals. GPR can locate something beneath the ground, but it cannot fully name it. Without excavation, those features remain mapped anomalies, powerful evidence of buried structure. but not yet complete archaeological proof. Methodological doubt appeared most clearly around the 2020 pit circle. Some archaeologists questioned whether the pits were human-made or natural solution hollows in the chalk of Salisbury Plain. Lead researchers argued that the scale, spacing, and circular arrangement did not match natural formation. But until those pits are excavated, that question cannot be closed completely. Physical limits also shaped what the survey could not reach. The Hidden Landscapes project mapped the land around Stonehenge, but motorized radar arrays could not pass through the standing trilithons. That means the ground directly beneath the famous stones remains unmapped at modern survey resolution. Possible voids, deposits, or structural traces under the monument itself are still unknown. Radar gives position, shape, depth, and relationship, but not time. The 3D map shows how buried features sit across the landscape, yet it cannot prove which came first without radiocarbon dating and excavation. That missing timeline matters because without it, the buried landscape remains a set of linked signals, not a fully readable sequence of human action. GPR revealed the buried landscape, but archaeology still has to explain it. That gap is where the three competing interpretations begin. With radar's limits now clear, Stonehenge stops being a single monument and becomes three possible interpretations of the same buried landscape. Most evidence supports a ceremonial system, a planned route beginning near Durrington Walls, moving through buried features and ending at the stone circle. Mike Parker Pearson's processional model, the Hidden Landscapes project, and the official updates by English Heritage and Historic England all point toward that wider reading. Support for this interpretation comes from how the features sit in relation to each other. The buried pathways, the cursus features, the Durrington Walls pit circle, and Stonehenge itself appear less like random pieces and more like parts of a structured experience. The scans do not prove every ritual movement, but they show a landscape where monuments seem positioned to guide people through space. Another professional reading sees the landscape differently. Instead of one designed system, it may be an archaeological palimpsest, layers of monuments built by different generations over roughly 1,500 years. This fits the known multi-phase history of Stonehenge, where construction changed between different periods. Under this view, the buried features are connected by sacred geography, not one master plan. Natural formation theory is the weakest, but it still matters. Some archaeologists questioned whether the 2020 signals near Durrington Walls were human-dug pits or natural solution hollows in the chalk. Lead researchers rejected that idea because the scale, spacing, and circular pattern do not match ordinary chalk hollows. Still, only excavation can close that question completely. Everything now depends on one physical test. If the Durrington Walls pit circle proves human-made, the ceremonial landscape reading gains enormous weight. If it proves natural, the largest buried monument disappears from the record. For now, the radar has given researchers three versions of the same buried ground, and only one excavation can decide which version survives. The buried landscape now has competing explanations, but the most realistic version begins with what the scans confirmed and what they changed about Stonehenge itself. Competing explanations leave the investigation with one grounded conclusion: Stonehenge was never just the stones. The most comprehensive geophysical survey ever conducted at a heritage site produced a three-dimensional map of a buried prehistoric landscape. It identified at least 17 unknown monuments, a timber post-hole circle, hidden detail inside the cursus, and a 2-kilometer pit circle near Durrington Walls, all invisible from the surface, all found without excavation. Most evidence points towards Stonehenge as the visible center of something larger. The stone circle may have been the surviving part of a wider ceremonial landscape, connected by processional pathways to monuments spread across kilometers of ground. In that reading, the buried features are not random leftovers. They are the missing context around Stonehenge, and without them, the purpose of the visible monument was always being judged from only one piece of the site. Professional debate still matters because the buried landscape may not be one single design. It could be a 1,500-year accumulation of monuments built by different generations for different purposes. The designed system interpretation is the strongest and most accepted by English Heritage and Historic England, But some archaeologists still see a layered sacred landscape rather than one coordinated plan. Honest use of the word solved requires caution. The scans did not finally explain what Stonehenge was for. They showed that the old question had been too narrow. Since 2014, researchers have known that every earlier theory was working from an incomplete object, the standing stones without the buried landscape around them. The mystery was not erased. It was resized. Real unanswered questions remain under the ground. The function of the Durrington Wall's pit circle is unknown. The exact dates of the 17 monuments still need excavation and radiocarbon dating. The processional route is not fully confirmed. Even the ground directly beneath the standing stones remains unmapped at modern resolution. The answer is closer now, but it still depends on physical investigation. A clearer version of the mystery now exists. Not what Stonehenge is alone, but what was buried around it, and why. Closer answers now depend on a boundary the scans could never cross. GPR surveys showed the buried Stonehenge landscape in shape, depth, and spatial arrangement, revealing features hidden for 5,000 years. But no geophysical instrument can show what those features meant to the people who built them, used them, and sometimes buried them. Radar can locate the remains, meaning still has to come from the ground itself. Durrington Walls is where that gap becomes most important. If excavation proves the pit circle was human-made, dates it by radiocarbon testing to Stonehenge's main phase, and finds signs of deliberate use before backfilling, the ceremonial landscape theory gains its strongest physical support. If those pits prove natural, the claimed largest prehistoric monument in Britain vanishes from the record. Stonehenge's most famous ground remains strangely unmeasured. The Hidden Landscapes project mapped the surrounding fields, but motorized GPR arrays could not move through the standing trilithons. That means the soil directly beneath the stones, the most watched archaeological space in the world, has never been scanned at modern resolution. Possible voids, deposits, or structural traces remain unknown. Deliberate backfilling would change everything if excavation confirms it. Builders may have dug the Durrington Walls pits, used them for a defined period, then closed them on purpose. That raises a sharper question than size alone. What was placed inside those pits? And why would people in prehistoric Britain decide to bury a monument this large beneath the fields? Solved is too final for what the evidence allows. The scans showed that Stonehenge had been studied at the wrong scale, with the wrong object in focus, for far too long. Ground-penetrating radar gave archaeologists the right landscape and the right targets. But the answer still waits beneath the soil. The excavation that could confirm it has not happened yet. Stonehenge was not fully solved. Radar only showed where the next answer must be dug from the ground.